You want to know what a man is worth. Don't watch him in the daylight when the whole town's looking. Watch him when he's asleep and doesn't know he's about to die. I've buried people I liked and shaken hands with people I didn't. And after 51 years on this dirt, I thought I'd stop being surprised by anybody. Then I sat on a cold ridge one October night and watched 6 armed men close a slow ring around one snoring old freight hauler who couldn't have stopped a house cat. And I found out I was wrong about almost everything. About him, about the men who came to kill him, and about the one choice a person makes when there's nobody around to see it and no reason on God's earth to make it. They had a plan, those 6. A good one, too. It ended in a disaster none of them saw coming, and the man who caused it never even reached for a gun. I'm going to tell you the whole thing, but I'll warn you now, the part that stays with you won't be the shooting. The first thing I noticed was that the mule wasn't scared. That's a small thing to build a night around, but you learn to read animals before you learn to read men, and a mule knows a wolf, knows a snake, knows a rider coming a mile off in the dark. This one, a big rawbone jack the color of wet ash, stood hobbled at the edge of the firelight with his ears loose and his lip hanging, half asleep on his feet, which told me the 6 men crawling up out of the wash toward him weren't strangers to that ground. They'd come slow. They'd come downwind. They knew what they were doing. I keep a tally book. Little leather thing, been through 3 cattle drives and a river, and I write down what I see because my memory's a liar and paper isn't. That night the first thing I wrote, hunched behind a shelf of rock with my knees complaining, was 6 men, 1 wagon, 1 old fool asleep under it. Nobody's scared but me. I want to be honest with you about myself before I tell you about the brave people, because I'm not one of them and I'd hate for you to get the wrong idea. My name's Crane. I ran a stringy little cattle operation up in the Dragoons, more rock than grass, and I'd come down that evening looking for 4 steers that had wandered off toward the Sulphur Springs Valley. I never found the steers. I found the wagon instead, sitting alone at the mouth of a dry wash the Mexicans called Cañada del Muerto, which ought to have told everybody something. And I'd stopped up on the ridge to water my horse and figure out whose fire that was down there. Then the men came, and I did the thing I am least proud of in a long life of unimpressive moments. I sat still. The old man under the wagon was named Amos Ford. I didn't know that yet. What I knew was the shape of him, heavy, gray, 1 boot off, and set neat beside him like a man does when his feet hurt and he's stopped caring who sees, an old blanket pulled to his chin, and the biggest, most peaceful set of snores I ever heard come out of a human being. He'd built his little fire down to coals. He had a coffee pot sitting in them, and a rifle leaned against the wagon wheel a good arm's length out of reach, which is where a rifle does you exactly no good. And if you'd asked me to bet money right then, I'd have bet you the whole ranch that man had maybe 2 minutes left on this earth. The one leading the 6 was a lean fellow in a good hat. You could tell the hat was the most expensive thing on him and that he knew it. He set the others with little motions of 2 fingers, quiet as a preacher, and they spread out around the wagon the way water spreads, no hurry, no noise, just filling in. One went for the mule's picket to cut it. One eased around toward the far wheel. 2 knelt in the wash with rifles up on the sleeping man. And the lean one and a boy, I'll get to the boy, came straight in on the fire. I wrote payroll robbers. They think it's a payroll wagon. I was right about that, and wrong about what it'd mean. See, there was a mine up at Middlemark that October, a silver dig, and payroll came through the valley on a wagon about that time of the month. And if you were the kind of man who'd rather take money than earn it, you'd have known that too. What you might not have known, what nobody down in that wash knew, was that the payroll had gone up the other road 4 days prior. And this wagon, this fat, slow, lonely wagon with the peaceful old man asleep beneath it, wasn't carrying silver dollars at all. It was carrying medicine. I didn't know that either, not yet. I'm telling it to you now so you feel it building the way I felt it. The way the whole thing was already crooked before the first man laid a hand on that mule. And none of them, not the robbers, not the old man, not the fool on the ridge writing in his little book, had the faintest idea what was actually about to happen down there in the dark. The lean man crouched by the fire and looked at the sleeping shape for a long moment, almost gentle. Then he reached out with his boot and nudged Amos Ford, the way you'd wake a friend, and said something I couldn't hear. Amos snorted, coughed, smacked his lips, opened his eyes. And here's the first thing that surprised me. The first crack in the plan they didn't know was a plan with a crack in it. The old man wasn't scared either. He blinked up at 6 armed strangers standing over him in the dead middle of the night, in a wash named for dead men, 40 miles from help, and his face did the thing a face does when it's disappointed but not surprised. Like a man who'd been rained on before and figured he'd be rained on again. "Well, hell," he said, and I heard that clear enough because the wash carried it. "Coffee's not even hot yet." The boy laughed. That was the second crack. The boy, 16, maybe 17, with a rifle too big for him, and a face that hadn't decided yet what kind of face it wanted to be, let out a short, surprised laugh, and the lean man in the good hat turned and looked at him, and the laugh died in the boy's throat like a bird that flew into glass. "I wrote in my book, the boy doesn't want to be here." Then I underlined it, because in my experience, the ones who don't want to be there are the ones that get everybody killed. Let me tell you about Amos Ford, because you can't understand what he did later if you think he was a fool, and you can't understand why I still think about him if you think he was a hero. He was neither. He was a freight man, which is its own particular breed, a man who hauls other men's goods across other men's country for wages that never quite catch up to the risk. 61 years old, widower. He'd lost his wife to the same kind of fever he was hauling medicine to fight, though I only learned that piece much later, and it landed on me like a hoof. He had a bad hip, a worse knee, and a habit, I'd come to see, of talking to his mule as if the mule were a partner in the business who happened to be quiet. The mule's name was Reuben. Amos had had him 9 years. When they cut Reuben's picket that night and let him off a few paces, the first thing the old man did before he thought about his own skin, before anything, was crane his neck to see where they were taking the mule. "Easy on him," he said to the man with the rope. "He kicks left. You'll want to know that before you find out." You have to understand how strange that is. A man wakes with 2 rifles on him and worries about his mule's temper. I've thought about it 1,000 times since. I think it wasn't courage exactly. I think Amos Ford had simply spent so long being responsible for things that weren't his: cargo, animals, other people's schedules. That responsibility had grown into his bones like a vine grows into a fence, until you couldn't tell anymore where the man stopped and the duty started. The lean man crouched and warmed his hands at the coals like he had all night. "Where's the box?" he said. Not a question. He said it tired, the way a man says a thing he said 100 times to 100 wagons. "There's no box," Amos said. "There's always a box." "There's a box," Amos allowed. "It's got liniment in it, and a jar of my late wife's peach preserves I've been saving, and about 40 pounds of paper that says who I owe and who owes me, which if you can make sense of it you're a better bookkeeper than the man at the mercantile. There's no silver. Payroll went up the Gleason Road Tuesday." I watched the lean man's face in the coal light. It didn't change, but his hand stopped over the fire just for a second. He'd heard the truth in it. Men who lie for a living can hear the truth the way a deaf man feels a wagon coming through the floor. And I saw the whole plan wobble on its axis right there. Because a plan for robbing a silver wagon is a fine, tight thing. And a plan for what you do when the silver wagon turns out to be a medicine wagon with an old widower and a peach jar is no plan at all. It's just 6 armed men standing around in the dark, with a decision to make that none of them wanted. "He's lying," said one of the men in the wash. Big fellow, flat voice, the kind of voice that's already decided. "He ain't lying," said the boy quiet. "Nobody asked you, Perry." So the boy's name was Perry. I wrote it down. I don't know why I write names down. I think part of me has always suspected I'd need to tell somebody someday who was there. Now I have to bring in the part that most folks don't believe when I tell it, and I've quit arguing with them, so I'll just set it down and you can do with it what you want. There were 7 parties in that wash that night, not 2. The old man was one. The gang was one. I was the third, useless on my ridge. And the fourth I didn't see until later, though they'd been there before any of us, up on the opposite rim, still as the rock, watching the whole business the way I was watching it, except they'd earned the right to and I hadn't. Apache. Chiricahua, I'd guess, though I never asked and it's not my place to say for certain. A handful of them, off the reservation or never on it, in that broken season after the surrenders when nobody's map matched anybody's memory, and a family could still slip through the seams of the country if they moved at night and asked nothing of anyone. Here's the thing I didn't know, sitting there judging everybody. Amos Ford had met them before. 2 days back on the Middlemark Road, he'd come across a Chiricahua woman, older than him, with a girl of maybe 8 burning up with the same fever the medicine in his wagon was meant to fight. Most freight men would have whipped the mule and looked straight ahead, because a wagon that stops for strangers in that country is a wagon that gets robbed, and a man seen helping Apache in 1886 could lose a lot more than his cargo. Amos Ford stopped. He didn't have much. He wasn't allowed to break into the mine's medicine. That was another man's property and other people's lives, and he was the kind of man who took that seriously. But he had his own things. He gave the woman his water. He gave the girl a spoonful, then 2, of a fever powder he carried for himself. He gave her the peach preserves, the ones he'd been saving, the ones from his dead wife's last summer's pudding up, because sugar and water is what you give a fevered child when you've got nothing better, and he had nothing better, and he gave away the last sweet thing he owned to a sick girl whose people had every reason to hate him and no reason at all to trust him. I know all this because the old woman told it to me, weeks after, through a young man who spoke both our tongues, when I went looking for the end of the story because I couldn't sleep for the not knowing. She told it plain, without decoration. She said he had spoken to the girl the whole time in a low, steady voice, though the child couldn't understand a word, the same voice, I imagine, he used on his mule. She said before he drove on he'd done a strange thing. He'd looked back at them a long moment and said something that made no sense to her then. The young man translated it for me, and I wrote it in the book and I have it still. He'd said, "Somebody watched over mine once. I'm just moving it along." And then he'd driven off into the country and made his cold camp in a wash named for dead men, and gone to sleep, and never known that on the ridge above him a debt was quietly deciding what it was worth. Back to the wash, back to the coals and the 6 men and the peach jar and the wobbling plan. The lean man had made up his mind. I could see it settle on him. When there's no silver, a hard man doesn't just ride away, because riding away means you were made a fool of, and men like that would rather leave a body than leave feeling foolish. He stood up out of his crouch, slow, and I saw his hand drift toward the pistol on his hip, casual, the way you'd reach to scratch, and I understood he was going to shoot the old man for the crime of not being rich. I want to tell you I stood up. I want to tell you I put my rifle over the rock and levered around and hollered down that valley that there was a witness. I didn't. I want that on the paper too, because this is a true story and true stories have a coward in them somewhere, and that night the coward was me. 6 guns. One of me. A wife of my own at home and a ranch that didn't run itself, and 100 good sensible reasons that altogether didn't weigh as much as one old man's life, and I knew it even then, knew it while I was using them, and I sat still and let the reasons stack up like cordwood between me and the thing I ought to have done. It was the boy who moved. Perry stepped between the lean man and the wagon. Not brave, exactly, his knees were shaking, I could see it from the ridge, his whole body was a question mark, but he stepped in and he said in a voice that cracked right down the middle, "He's got a sick kid's medicine in there, Cole. It goes to Middlemark. There's fever in Middlemark. You take that wagon, you're killing whoever's waiting on it same as if you shot him. Silence, even the coals seemed to quit ticking. The lean man, Cole, looked at the boy for a long, long time. "How do you know what's in the wagon?" he said, very soft. And I saw the boy realize, a half-second too late, the size of the mistake he'd made. Because there was only one way he could have known what was in that wagon. He'd have had to have seen it, which meant he'd been up ahead somewhere earlier, scouting, and he'd looked, and he'd known, and he hadn't told the others, because Perry the boy with the too big rifle had been trying, in his clumsy 16-year-old way, to steer 6 killers away from a medicine wagon without any of them noticing he was doing it. He'd almost pulled it off, too. That's the part that breaks my heart even now. He'd almost pulled it off. The big flat-voiced man in the wash said, "The little rat's been holding out on us." And Cole drew his pistol. He didn't point it at the old man anymore. He pointed it at the boy. "Now here is where the night turned, and I need you to have all the pieces in your hand so you feel it break the way it broke. Understand what stood in that wash. One old freight man, 61, one boot off, a bad hip, a rifle out of reach, a mule that kicked left. One frightened boy with a gun aimed at his chest by a man who a moment before had been his captain. 4 hard men who'd come for silver and found a reason to be angry instead, which is the most dangerous cargo of all. A coward on a ridge with a full magazine and an empty spine. And up on the far rim, invisible patient adept." The wash was dry. It had been dry for weeks. But 40 miles north up in the Grams, it had been raining all evening, the kind of high mountain rain you can't see or hear from down in the valley, the kind that gathers quiet in 100 little cuts and gullies and pours itself, all at once, into the low country's dry veins. Cañada del Muerto wasn't named for the men who died fighting in it. It was named for the men who died sleeping in it in the dark, when the water came down the wash the way it comes. Not as a wave you can run from, but as a wall you never hear until it's on you. Amos Ford knew that. Freight men know their roads. He'd made his camp up on the shoulder of the wash, not in the belly of it, and I'd taken it for laziness, an old man too stiff to haul his gear down to level ground. It wasn't laziness. He'd camped high on purpose, the way you'd batten a shutter you didn't think you'd need, out of an old careful habit of a man responsible for things. The gang was down in the belly of the wash. And 40 miles north, the mountains had already made their decision, and the water was already coming, and the only living soul in that whole valley who'd hear it in time was an old man who talked to his mule. Cole thumbed back the hammer. The boy shut his eyes. "That's where I have to leave it, and I'm sorry, because I've carried the next part for a long time, and I know exactly how heavy it is to hand somebody." Down in the wash, a pistol was cocked at a boy's heart. Up in the mountains, a wall of black water was already moving. And on the ridge, I finally put my hand on my rifle, not because I'd found my courage, but because I'd heard, faint under the wind, 40 miles off and closing fast, a sound like a train with no tracks. Amos Ford heard it too. I saw his head come up. And what he did next, with 2 rifles on him, and a boy about to die, and the ground itself about to try to kill them all, is the thing I came here to tell you. You've heard water before. Rain on a roof, a creek in spring, the river at the ford. Forget all of it. Flash water in a dry wash doesn't sound like water. It sounds like the ground clearing its throat to say something final. I heard it before I understood it. A low shudder up through the rock I was sitting on, more felt than heard, like a big animal turning over in its sleep a long way off. Then the wind brought the rest of it, a grinding, tumbling roar, rocks and brush and whole dead trees all going over each other in the dark, and under that a hiss that raised every hair on my arms, because I finally knew what it was, and I knew it was already too late to be smart about it. Down in the belly of the wash, 6 men heard it a half-second after me. You could watch it hit them one at a time. The big flat-voiced man turned his head. Cole's pistol wavered off the boy. One of the riflemen in the wash said a word I won't write down. And that half-second, That stupid, human, disbelieving half-second where a man hears death coming and spends the time asking himself, is that really, instead of moving? That half-second is what the Wash had been waiting for since before any of them were born. But before I tell you what the water did, I have to tell you what the old man did, because he moved first. He moved before the rest of us finished being afraid. Amos Ford was up on the shoulder of the Wash, remember. High ground. The water, when it came, was going to fill the belly and maybe lick at the edges, but it wasn't coming for him. He'd camped careful. He was, of all 7 souls in that canyon, the one man who was going to be perfectly, entirely fine. He got up anyway. I saw him haul himself off the ground, old hip, bad knee, one boot on grabbed the wheel of his wagon, and instead of climbing up, away, toward the safe dark of the ridge, he started down the shoulder, down toward the belly of the Wash where 6 armed men who'd come to kill him were standing frozen in the path of a wall of water. I wrote 3 words in my book later, when my hands could hold a pencil again, and they're the truest 3 words in it. He went down. Now understand, I keep saying understand, but I need you to. I need at least one person besides me to hold this the right way. He did not owe them a thing. They had cocked a gun on him. They'd cut his mule's picket. They were, to a man, exactly the kind of trash the country would have been cleaner without. And if Amos Ford had climbed up onto that ridge and sat down next to me and watched the Wash take the whole gang, no court in the territory and no God I've ever heard preached would have held it against him. He went down anyway, because there was a boy down there. Here's what the water did. It came around the bend of the Wash in the dark like a black horse 40 feet tall. I don't have better words than that, and I've had years to look for them. It hit the belly of the Wash, and everything that had been dry a heartbeat before was gone. The coals hissed out. The fire, the little camp, the neat set-down boot, all of it swallowed at once. The 2 riflemen who'd been kneeling low in the Wash never had a chance. The water took them the way you take a leaf off a table with your hand. I never saw them again, and neither did anyone else. The big flat-voiced man was higher and quicker. He turned and ran for the shoulder, and the water caught him at the knees, then the waist, and I watched it walk him sideways down the canyon still on his feet, running on nothing, his hat gone, and then he wasn't running anymore. Cole, the lean man, the good hat, the plan. Cole was closest to the wagon, closest to high ground, and he did the one thing a man like him always does. He saved himself. He clawed up the shoulder, scrabbling, and got clear, and stood there dripping and heaving on the safe rock with his pistol still in his fist, and he did not once look back for anybody. Which left the boy. Perry had frozen, 16 years old, with a gun that had just been pointed at his heart, and when the water came he did what the young do, which is nothing, because nothing in a boy's short life has taught him yet that the world will actually, genuinely kill him. He stood in the belly of the Wash and watched the black horse come, and he did not move. Amos Ford hit him at a dead run, as dead a run as a 61-year-old freight man with a bad knee can manage down a slope in the dark, and drove him sideways, both of them, off the low ground and into the tangle of brush and rock on the shoulder, half a step, maybe less, ahead of the water. The Wash took Amos's legs out from under him. I saw it. The edge of that black wall caught him at the shins as he shoved the boy clear, and it spun him, and for one horrible moment he was in it up to his chest, one arm hooked around a dead mesquite root, and the other fist knotted in the collar of Perry's shirt, holding the boy up out of the current by main strength while the water tried to take them both. And here's the thing about endurance. It's not a grand thing. It's not a war whoop or a last stand. Endurance is an old man's hand refusing to open. That's all it is. It's 40 pounds of grip in a fist that has hauled freight for 40 years, closed around a stranger's collar, not opening, while the whole weight of a mountain's worth of runoff argues with it. He held. I don't know how. I've hauled rope and wrestled steers my whole life, and I do not know how that man held. But the water is a bully, and bullies get bored, and after the first killing surge, the wash settled from a wall to a torrent to a mean fast river, and the level dropped a foot, then two, and Amos Ford was still there, chest deep, one arm around a root and one fist around a boy, and both of them alive. The mule saved them the rest of the way. Reuben, 9 years, kicks left, had been led off to the side by the man cutting his picket, and when the water came, that man let go of the rope and ran, and the mule did not. Mules don't panic the way horses do. A mule's fear has arithmetic in it. Reuben backed up the shoulder to high ground, dragging his cut picket rope, and stood there, and when Amos got one hand free and slapped the water and called him, I heard it, thin and choking. "Reuben, Reuben, here." That mule walked down as close to the edge as his own good sense allowed and put himself in reach. Amos got the trailing picket rope, wrapped it around his fist, and that ash-gray mule leaned back into his own weight, all 900 pounds of him, and hauled the two of them up out of the wash a foot at a time, the old man and the boy, until they were lying in the brush on solid ground, coughing black water, alive. I was already coming down off my ridge by then. Finally, too late to matter, which is the coward's exact and permanent portion. You always arrive just in time to help clean up the courage other people already spent. But I wasn't the only one coming down. They came off the far rim without a sound. 4 of them, I'd been wrong. There'd been more than a handful down the opposite shoulder in the gray almost light before dawn, and my hand went to my rifle out of pure animal habit before my head caught up and told me the truth. They weren't coming for the old man. They'd been up there all night. They'd watched the whole thing the way I had, except where I'd sat frozen behind my reasons. They'd been waiting to see what kind of man the water left them. The old woman was with them, the one from the Middlemark Road, and when she came down to where Amos Ford lay in the brush, soaked and shaking and too spent to stand, she knelt down by him in the wet gray light and put her hand flat on his chest, over his heart, the way you'd check a thing you'd been afraid you'd lost. And the girl was there too, the fevered girl, the peach jar girl, walking now, thin and unsteady but walking, the fever broken, alive because 2 days before a freight man had stopped his wagon when every sensible bone in his body told him to drive on. I stood at the edge of it with my rifle hanging useless in my hand, and I understood, finally, what I'd watched all night. It wasn't a robbery. It hadn't been a robbery since the moment the wagon turned out to carry medicine instead of silver. It was a debt, coming due in the dark, in a wash named for the dead. A debt Amos Ford didn't know he'd made and couldn't have called in if he'd wanted to. Paid back by a mountain's worth of water and a family that had been keeping watch over the man who'd kept watch over their own. Somebody watched over mine once, he'd told them. I'm just moving it along. They'd been moving it right back. Now the hard part, the heavy decision, because a true story doesn't get to end on the pretty picture, and I've never yet told this one without wishing it did. Cole was still up on the shoulder, alive, dripping, pistol in his fist. He'd saved himself and no one else, and he was standing there in the growing light watching the 4 Chiricahua gather around the man he'd meant to rob, and I saw him do the arithmetic. 1 old man, 1 spent boy, 4 Apache, 1 rancher. And himself with a loaded gun and the high ground. And I saw him decide he could still walk out of this the winner if he was quick and hard about it. He raised the pistol, toward the old woman, toward the girl. I want to tell you I shot him. I had the rifle. I finally had the angle and the light and every reason in the world. I didn't get the chance. Amos Ford, flat on his back, half drowned, unable to stand, got up on one elbow, and instead of ducking, instead of saving the little strength he had left, he did the last responsible thing of that long, responsible night. He threw himself over the girl, old body over small one, covering her the way he'd covered the boy, the way he covered everything the world put near him that it might try to hurt. And the boy, Perry, the boy who didn't want to be there, the boy who tried all night to steer 6 killers wrong, the boy Amos had just pulled out of the water with his bare fist. Perry picked up his too big rifle out of the mud where the flood had left it, and pointed it at the man who'd made him a robber, and said something I'll carry to my own grave. He said, "You don't get to, not after what he just did, you don't get to." Cole looked at the boy for a long moment in the gray light, the same long look he'd given him at the fire, hours and a whole world ago. And I've thought about this more than I've thought about almost anything. I think for 1 second Cole saw what the rest of us saw. That the boy was already gone from him. That the water had washed something out of that canyon that wasn't ever coming back, and it wasn't the 2 dead men, and it wasn't the silver that had never been there. It was the boy. He'd lost the boy. He lowered the pistol. Then he turned and climbed the shoulder and walked off north up the wash in the dawn, alone, wet, and empty-handed, and nobody stopped him, and I have wondered every year since whether we should have. That's the moral weight I said I'd hand you. It isn't the flood. The flood was easy. The flood was God's arithmetic and none of ours. The heavy part is that we let a killer walk because an old man's mercy had gotten into all of us by then, thick as the mud. And mercy is a beautiful thing right up until you have to wonder who Cole hurt next, down the road, in some other wash, some other night, because 6 of us with our own good reasons all stood in the gray light and let him go. I don't know the answer. I've quit pretending I might. They didn't stay, the Chiricahua. Dawn's no time for them to be seen on a road with a white man's wagon, and the country in that year had no soft place in it for what they were. The old woman helped Amos sit up. The girl, I'll never forget this, the girl took something out of a fold of her dress and pressed it into his hand and closed his fingers over it, the way he'd closed his fist over the boy in the water. It was the peach jar, empty, scraped clean, washed in some creek somewhere and kept. The last sweet thing his dead wife ever put up, given away to a fevered child, and given back now empty because the child had lived on what was in it. He looked at that empty jar in his hand for a long time. Then he laughed this wet, broken, astonished laugh, and I think it was the truest sound made in that canyon all night, and I don't have it in me to explain it to you, and I'm not going to try. They went up the far shoulder and into the broken country and were gone before the sun cleared the ridge, and I never saw them again, though I went looking, and the old woman told me the rest of it weeks later through the young man who spoke both tongues, and that's how I know the parts I couldn't see. Amos Ford drove his wagon into Middlemark 2 days late with the axle cracked and the medicine dry, because he'd wrapped the crate in his own blanket and his own oilcloth and held it up out of the wet, and the fever in that camp broke inside the week, and I don't know how many people are walking around the territory today who'd be under it if a freight man had kept a better schedule and a harder heart. Neither does anyone. That's how that kind of arithmetic works. You never get to see the number. You just have to trust it was more than 0 and go on. He kept the boy. That surprised the whole valley, but it stopped surprising me the minute I heard it, because by then I understood the man. Perry had no people that would own him and a past that would hang him in any town that learned it, and Amos Ford looked at a 16-year-old the water had spat back up, and did the only thing his particular disease of responsibility would let him do. He took him on as a freight hand, taught him the roads. Taught him, I have to think, the low steady voice you use on a frightened animal or a frightened boy, which turn out to be the same voice. I saw them once more, about a year on, coming through the Sulphur Springs Valley with a full load and that same ash-gray mule out front, older, grayer, still kicking left. The boy had grown into his rifle and out of needing it. Amos lifted 2 fingers off the reins when he saw me. That was all. That was his whole hello, and I lifted mine back, and we didn't stop, and that was the last time. He died in his sleep 3 winters later. They tell me, in a bed in a house, with the boy, a man by then, in the next room. Which is the wrong ending for a story like this, and the right ending for a man like that, and I've made my peace with the 2 of them not matching. I still have the tally book. It's on the shelf by the window where the light's best, and I take it down more than I used to, now that my own nights run long. Most of it's cattle and weather and money owed. But there's the 1 page from that October, the 6 men and the 1 old fool asleep under his wagon, "Nobody's scared but me," and the boy's name underlined, and the 3 words I set down when my hand finally stopped shaking. He went down. I've thought about erasing the part where I sat still on the ridge. Nobody would ever know. But I've left it, all these years, because the story isn't true without the coward in it, and because somewhere in the leaving it there, I think I finally learned the thing Amos Ford already knew before the water ever came. That being brave once in the light, where people can see you, doesn't cost much of anything. And that the whole weight of a life is in what your fist does in the dark when it's got nothing to gain and no reason on earth to keep from opening. And no one is watching but the water, and it holds.